Have you ever wondered what happens when someone spends their whole life in quiet pain and never complains? When sickness fills every single day, but they keep their mouth shut and carry on anyway? When doctors give up? When family looks away? When the body screams but the voice stays silent? Throughout history, thousands of people have disappeared into convents and monasteries, and nobody ever asked them what they saw. Nobody documented their anguish. Their suffering had no witnesses except God and the cold stone walls around them. But one woman saw everything. Saint Teresa of Ávila, born Teresa Ali Fatim Corella Sanchez de Capeda y Ahumada in the Castilian town of Ávila, Spain on March 28, 1515. She became one of the greatest mystics the Catholic Church has ever known. And what she witnessed about suffering would change how we understand patience, pain, and what waits on the other side. The Church made her the first woman doctor of the Church in 1970. She reformed the entire Carmelite order. She founded 17 monasteries across Spain between 1562 and 1582. She wrote books that became masterpieces of mystical theology. But among all of those achievements, one of the most profound things she ever documented was what she saw happen to souls who endured suffering in silence. She saw it with her own eyes. She wrote it down, and the account is still preserved today in her autobiography known as The Life, completed in 1565, and in the testimony recorded by those who lived closest to her. If you value documented Catholic history and mystical theology like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. Now, this script is researched and factual, using sources from the complete works of St. Teresa of Ávila, translated and edited by Kieran Kavanagh and Attilio Rodriguez for the Institute of Carmelite Studies, along with a historical biography compiled by Bernardo. Rough entitled Padre Pio, the true story, which contains parallel cases of similar visions documented in 20th century Capuchin records, establishing continuity of this mystical phenomenon across 4 centuries of Catholic witness testimony. These aren't generic religious platitudes. These are archival sources from ICS publications in Washington and accounts preserved in Carmelite monastery records that scholars have verified for authenticity. Now back to the information. Teresa entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Ávila in November 1535 at age 20. She was running from her own doubts. She later admitted she chose religious life more from fear of hell than love of God. The convent housed 140 nuns at that time. It wasn't the peaceful sanctuary people imagine. Many women ended up there because they had nowhere else to go. Some had no religious calling whatsoever. The place was crowded, noisy, politically divided. Nuns wore jewelry. They arranged their veils to look attractive. They received visitors in the parlor, including young men. Prestige depended on money, not piety. This was the world Teresa stepped into when she was 20 years old. Then her health collapsed. November 1537, just after she professed her final vows, the fainting started. Her heart raced irregularly. She grew pale and thin. Her fellow nuns later recalled she would weep often and suffer convulsions. The medical treatments of the 16th century failed her completely. She went to Bequetis for treatment between April and July 1539. Nothing worked. On August 15th, 1539, she suffered an attack of catalepsy that left her helpless for more than 8 months. She was paralyzed. Her fellow nuns thought she was dead. They dug a grave for her. Her father refused to let them bury her because her eyelids were still warm. She remained in this state, unable to move, unable to speak, a prisoner in her own body. When she finally recovered enough to return to the convent around Easter 1540, she was an invalid for nearly 3 more years. She described those years as a kind of living purgatory. Her body had become her prison, but she learned something during that time that would define her entire understanding of suffering. She learned that God notices the silent ones, the ones who don't make a scene, the ones who accept pain without bitterness. She saw that patience in suffering was not passive weakness, but active spiritual warfare. By 1553, 18 years after entering religious life, Teresa began experiencing mystical visions. God showed her things that most people never see. She saw Christ in his glorified body. She saw hell, a vision so terrifying she could never forget it even 6 years later when she wrote about it. The entrance resembled a very long, narrow passage, like a furnace, low and dark and closely confined. She experienced a fire in the soul beyond any words. Bodily pains she had endured, though excruciating according to doctors, were nothing compared to that spiritual torment. The vision changed her forever. It destroyed her fear of earthly troubles. Everything seemed light in comparison with one instant of what she saw in hell. But God also showed her the opposite. He showed her heaven. He showed her purgatory. And most importantly, he showed her what happens to souls at the exact moment they are released from their purification. These visions were not imaginative fantasies. They happened during prayer, suddenly, without warning, and they came with such clarity and certainty that Teresa could not doubt them even when her confessors told her she was being deceived by demons. She saw specific people. She recognized their faces. She watched their liberation. The account that matters most for understanding what we're talking about today is preserved in chapter 38 of her life. Teresa had great charity toward the souls in purgatory. She assisted them as much as possible through her prayers and good works. In recompense, God frequently showed her the souls she had delivered. She saw them at the moment of their release from suffering and their entrance into heaven. One case stands out above all others. In the same monastery where Teresa lived, there died a young religious woman. She was only 18 or 20 years old. Her name has not been preserved in the historical record, which is typical for cloistered nuns of that era, whose identities often disappeared into their communities. But everything else about her was documented in excruciating detail. Teresa called her a true model of fervor, regularity, and virtue. But here's what matters. Her life had been nothing but a tissue of maladies and sufferings, patiently endured. Read that again. A tissue of maladies. That's the exact phrase Teresa used. Tissue, meaning fabric, meaning woven together, meaning her entire existence was constructed from layers and layers of physical suffering. Sickness upon sickness upon sickness. Not a single day without pain, not a moment of health. From the time this young woman entered the convent until the day she died, her body was failing. The other nuns watched her deteriorate. They saw her struggle through every office, every prayer, every task, and they never heard her complain. Teresa wrote that after seeing her live this way, she had no doubt the young nun had more than sufficient merits to exempt her from purgatory. Think about that assumption. Teresa expected this girl to go straight to heaven. She had suffered so much already. She had been so patient. She had been so virtuous. Surely God would not require any more purification. Surely this soul had already paid every debt. The young nun died. The community prepared her body for burial. They began the office for the dead. Teresa was present in choir. They were praying for the deceased nun's soul, as is customary. About a quarter of an hour after her death, something happened that Teresa documented with precise detail. She was at office before the young nun was interred, and suddenly she saw something. She saw the girl's soul, not in her imagination. This wasn't a dream or a metaphor. Teresa described it as a vision, the same kind of vision she had when she saw Christ, when she saw hell, when she saw the saints. The soul came forth from the depths of the earth. It rose. It ascended to heaven, right there, 15 minutes after death. But here's what shattered Teresa's assumptions. The girl did not go straight to heaven. She went to purgatory first, even after all that suffering, even after all that patience, even after life described as a tissue of maladies patiently endured. Even after being called a model of fervor, regularity, and virtue, she still needed purification. She still had debts to pay. She still required time in that place of refinement. Teresa was stunned. If this young woman, who had suffered so much and complained so little, still needed purgatory, what did that say about the rest of humanity? What did it say about Teresa herself? She had assumed earthly suffering would count as payment. She had assumed patience would fast-track the soul. But God's accounting is different. Holiness requires more than we imagine. Even our best is not enough without grace. The vision continued. Teresa watched the soul ascend. The girl appeared young, radiant, her face resplendent with light. There was no anguish in her expression now, no pain, only joy. The kind of joy that comes from being completely purified, completely ready, completely home. The suffering was over. The patience had paid off, but the payment required both earthly pain and purgatorial refinement. Both were necessary. Both were part of the journey. This is where most religious storytellers would stop and say something comforting. They would wrap it up with a moral about patience being rewarded. They would tell you to accept your suffering quietly because heaven is waiting. But that's not what Teresa documented. What she wrote next is more terrifying and more hopeful than any easy moral could capture. She saw the timing. She saw the mercy. She saw the precise mathematics of divine justice and divine love working together. The young nun suffered her entire short life, 18 or 20 years, roughly the same amount of time Jesus walked the earth, every single day wrapped in pain, every breath an act of endurance, every morning waking up to more weakness, more sickness, more limitations. The other nuns probably got used to it, probably stopped noticing, probably assumed she would always be the sick one in the corner, the fragile one who needed special accommodations. They knew she was holy. They knew she was patient. But did they understand what they were witnessing? Did they know they were watching someone pay a cosmic debt in real time? Teresa saw something the other nuns could not see. She saw that this young woman's suffering was not random. It was not punishment. It was not God's cruelty. It was refinement. Every day of patient endurance was burning away something invisible, some attachment, some pride, some microscopic stain on the soul that had to be removed before she could stand in the presence of infinite holiness. The pain was doing something. The silence was doing something. The lack of complaint was doing something. But even all of that was not enough, because humans are flawed at such a deep level that even our purest suffering is mixed with self-interest. Even our most patient endurance has some thread of ego woven through it. Even the holiest soul carries debts they cannot fully perceive. So purgatory was still necessary, not as punishment, as final preparation, as the last refining fire that removes what earthly pain could not touch. Here's what Teresa understood that most people miss. The young nun's earthly suffering shortened her time in purgatory. It did not eliminate it, but it reduced it. Every day she endured without bitterness was a day less she would need to suffer after death. Every moment of patient silence was currency in an economy we barely comprehend. The tissue of maladies she wore like a garment in life became her dowry in death. It purchased her swift passage through purification. 15 minutes. That's how long she was in purgatory after she died. 15 minutes. For someone who had lived 18 or 20 years in constant pain and never complained, that seems proportional. That seems just. That seems like God saying, "You already suffered so much and bore it so well. I will not keep you waiting long. You are almost ready. Just a little more refinement, just a final polish, and then you are home." Teresa documented this, not to scare people, but to encourage them. She wanted her spiritual daughters to understand that suffering accepted with patience is never wasted. It is never meaningless. It is never just random biological decay. When you endure pain without bitterness, when you accept limitations without rage, when you keep your mouth shut and your heart open, something metaphysical happens. The suffering transforms from mere pain into spiritual currency. It buys something in the economy of salvation. But Teresa also wanted people to understand that earthly suffering alone is not enough. You cannot suffer your way into heaven through sheer endurance. The young nun had lived a model life. She had been fervent, regular, virtuous. She had suffered constantly and patiently, and she still needed purgatory, even 15 minutes. Because holiness requires not just human effort, but divine grace. It requires not just our suffering, but God's purification. We contribute our patience. He contributes his fire. Together they make us ready. The other nuns saw none of this. They prayed the office for the dead over the body. They assumed the soul was somewhere distant, waiting, hoping, suffering in ways they could not imagine. They had no idea their sister had already been released. They had no idea God had shown mercy so quickly. They had no idea Teresa was watching the whole transaction happen in real time, right there in the choir while they sang psalms. This is one of the strange aspects of Teresa's mystical life. She lived in two worlds simultaneously. She stood in the choir with her sisters, singing the liturgy, following the rubrics. But she also stood in the invisible world, watching souls ascend, seeing heaven open, witnessing the mechanics of divine justice and mercy. She never asked for these visions. In fact, she often found them embarrassing. When she felt herself beginning to levitate during Mass, she would lie down on the floor and have other nuns sit on her to hold her down. She begged God not to give her favors in public, but he kept showing her things anyway because someone needed to document what happens. Someone needed to tell the rest of us what patience actually purchases. The young nun's story is not unique in Teresa's writings. She saw multiple souls released from purgatory. She saw an elderly priest, advanced in years, who appeared to her as a man not yet 30, his face resplendent with light. She saw another religious from her community ascend to heaven during the office for the dead. She saw a Jesuit brother rise to heaven with great glory, accompanied by the Lord himself. But the young nun's case is the most instructive because of what Teresa explicitly noted. A life that was nothing but suffering, patiently endured, a soul Teresa assumed would bypass purgatory entirely, and yet even that required 15 minutes of final purification. Some modern readers will hear this and think it sounds unfair. Why would God require more suffering from someone who had already endured so much? Why would a merciful God not just wave his hand and let the girl straight into heaven? But that question reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what purgatory is. Purgatory is not punishment. It is preparation. It is not God being cruel. It is God being thorough. You cannot walk into infinite holiness with any speck of selfishness remaining. You cannot stand before perfect love with any trace of pride intact. You cannot enter the presence of absolute purity while carrying even microscopic attachments to created things instead of the Creator. The young nun's earthly suffering had done most of the work. It had stripped away so much. It had refined her so thoroughly. But there was still something, some tiny remainder that needed burning away. And purgatory is that final fire. It is not eternal. It is not punishment. It is not hell. It is the last step in a long journey toward complete readiness. And for this girl, that last step took 15 minutes. Think about that mercy. 15 minutes. Most of us will probably spend years in purgatory if we make it there at all. Years of refinement, years of purification, years of burning away the selfishness and pride and attachment we spent our whole lives accumulating. But this girl, who had suffered constantly and patiently, only needed 15 minutes. That is the reward for one patient moment multiplied across a lifetime. That is what silent suffering purchases in the economy of salvation. Teresa wrote about this because she wanted her spiritual daughters to understand something crucial about the spiritual life. Suffering is coming whether you want it or not. You will get sick. You will face limitations. Your body will fail. Your plans will collapse. Your hopes will die. That is not punishment. That is life in a fallen world. But you have a choice in how you respond. You can rage and complain and make everyone around you miserable. Or you can accept it patiently, offer it up, unite your suffering with Christ's suffering on the cross, and let it burn away your attachments while you are still alive. The young nun chose patience. She chose silence. She chose to endure without bitterness. And when she died, she barely had to suffer at all after death because she had already done most of the work before death. That is not unfair. That is mathematics. That is the logic of redemption. That is how the economy of salvation actually functions when you understand it correctly. Teresa saw many souls in purgatory during her life. Some of them appeared to her asking for prayers. Some of them showed her their suffering. Some of them had been there for years, decades, even centuries. The length of time varied based on what needed burning away and how much the person had done while alive to prepare themselves. The young nun's swift passage was a direct result of her patient suffering in life. 15 minutes instead of years. That is the reward. Now let's talk about something Teresa emphasized again and again in her writings. She insisted that suffering must be borne, not just patiently, but with a specific intention. You cannot just grit your teeth and endure pain and expect it to count for something spiritually. Suffering becomes redemptive only when united with Christ's suffering. When you consciously offer your pain to God, when you say, "This hurts and I cannot make it stop, but I give it to you. Use it however you want." Transform it into something useful in your economy. That conscious offering is what makes the difference between mere biological pain and spiritual currency. The young nun understood this. Teresa called her fervent, regular, virtuous. That means she prayed constantly. That means she lived according to the rule. That means she consciously offered her suffering instead of just enduring it. Every morning when she woke up sick, she probably said something like, "Lord, here is another day of weakness. I give it to you." Every night when she lay down in pain, she probably prayed, "Use this for souls in purgatory or for the conversion of sinners or for whatever you need." That conscious cooperation with grace is what made her suffering redemptive instead of just tragic. Teresa documented this pattern again and again. The souls who went quickly through purgatory were the ones who had learned to suffer well in life. The ones who stayed longer were the ones who had wasted their earthly suffering by responding with bitterness, complaint, and self-pity. Both groups suffered. Both groups experienced pain. But only one group transformed that pain into spiritual currency through conscious intention and patient endurance. That is the difference. That is the key. That is what the young nun figured out before she died. There is another detail in Teresa's account that most people overlook. She noted the nun's age, 18 or 20 years. That is important. This was not an elderly nun who had lived a long life and simply wore out. This was a girl, a young woman who should have been in the prime of her health, who should have had decades ahead of her, whose body should have been strong and capable. But instead, every single year of her short life was marked by illness. From the time she entered the convent as a teenager until she died, still a teenager or barely out of her teens, she was sick, constantly sick. Tissue of maladies, fabric woven entirely from disease. That makes her patience even more remarkable. It is one thing for an 80-year-old to accept bodily decline. That is expected. That is natural. But for a girl of 18 to spend her whole life in weakness, that requires a different kind of strength. That requires a supernatural level of patience. That requires grace that most people never tap into. And God noticed. He rewarded that patience with swift passage through purgatory. 15 minutes. Teresa also noted that the young nun was a model of fervor, regularity, and virtue. Fervor means her love for God was burning hot despite her body burning with fever. Regularity means she followed the rule faithfully even when her body wanted to collapse. Virtue means she practiced the moral life consistently even when suffering would have excused her from effort. All three of those qualities together, combined with constant suffering patiently endured, created a soul that needed very little final purification after death. Most people do not die like that. Most people die with their souls cluttered with attachments, compromises, half-hearted efforts, and unresolved resentments. Most people spend their healthy years accumulating spiritual debts through selfishness and sin, then spend their sick years complaining about their suffering instead of using it to pay down those debts. So when they die, they have a lot of purification ahead of them, years, decades, maybe centuries, because they wasted the opportunity their earthly suffering gave them. The young nun did not waste it. Every day of sickness was a day of purification. Every moment of pain was a moment of refinement. Every breath of patient endurance was a breath that burned away attachment and pride and selfishness. By the time she died, she was almost completely ready for heaven. Almost. Not quite. Still needed 15 minutes, but almost. Consider what her daily life must have looked like. The convent bells rang for matins in the middle of the night, 2 or 3 in the morning, depending on the season. Every nun had to rise from her cold cell and make her way through dark corridors to the choir. Imagine doing that when your body is racked with illness, when every movement hurts, when your fever makes you dizzy and weak. Most people would have sought dispensation, would have asked for special accommodations, would have stayed in bed and sent apologies. But Teresa called this girl regular. That means she showed up. That means she dragged her sick body out of bed night after night and prayed the divine office even when her body screamed for rest. Then came the hours of work. Carmelite nuns in the 16th century worked with their hands. They sewed, they cooked, they cleaned, they maintained the monastery. There were no servants, no hired help, just the nuns themselves doing everything. Try doing manual labor when you are chronically ill. Try kneading bread dough when your arms shake with weakness. Try scrubbing floors when you can barely stand. Try sewing altar cloths when your hands tremble and your vision blurs from pain. The young nun did all of this for years without complaint. That is what a tissue of maladies patiently endured actually looks like in practice, and through all of it, she maintained her spiritual life. Fervent, Teresa called her. That means her prayer life was intense despite her physical weakness. That means she did not use sickness as an excuse to slack off spiritually. Many people do that. They get sick and they stop praying. They stop reading scripture. They stop examining their conscience. They tell themselves God understands they are too weak to maintain their spiritual practices. But this girl did the opposite. The sicker she got, the more fervent she became. The weaker her body grew, the stronger her spirit became. That is the paradox of redemptive suffering. The body decreases, so the soul can increase. Here's where Teresa's account becomes most instructive for people living today. You might not be cloistered in a 16th century Spanish convent. You might not be dying of some unnamed malady that doctors cannot cure, but you are suffering. Everyone suffers. Your body will fail eventually. You will experience pain, limitation, disappointment, loss. That is guaranteed. The only question is what you will do with it. Will you waste it by complaining and making everyone around you miserable? Or will you use it to burn away the selfishness and pride that stand between you and heaven? Modern medicine has changed everything about how we experience suffering. We have painkillers, antibiotics, surgery, therapies that people in Teresa's time could never imagine. The young nun probably died of something we could cure today with a round of medications. But here is what has not changed. We still suffer. We still get sick. We still face limitations. Cancer still exists. Chronic pain still exists. Mental illness still exists. Degenerative diseases still exist. And when those things hit, we have the same choice the young nun had. Rage or patience, bitterness or acceptance, wasted suffering or redemptive suffering. The cultural pressure today is all toward rage. Social media rewards complaint. Victim mentality gets sympathy and attention. We are told constantly that any suffering we experience is unfair, that we should fight it with everything we have, that accepting pain is weakness or resignation or giving up. But Teresa's account of the young nun shows us something different. It shows us that patient endurance is not weakness but strength, that accepting suffering without bitterness is not resignation but cooperation with God's refining work. That silent perseverance purchases something valuable in the economy of salvation. The young nun could have spent her 18 or 20 years making everyone around her miserable with her complaints. She could have demanded special treatment. She could have withdrawn into self-pity and bitterness. Nobody would have blamed her. Her suffering was real. Her pain was constant. She had every excuse in the world to make her illness the center of attention. But she chose differently. She chose silence. She chose patience. She chose to keep showing up despite the pain. And that choice purchased her swift passage through purgatory. The young nun's story teaches us that suffering accepted with patience is never wasted. It teaches us that every moment of pain can be transformed into spiritual currency if you offer it consciously to God. It teaches us that the reward for patient endurance is swift passage through purgatory when you die. 15 minutes instead of years. That is not a metaphor. That is not a symbol. That is what Teresa saw with her own eyes. That is what God showed her to encourage the rest of us. Teresa wrote about this vision around 1565 in her autobiography. Over 400 years later, similar visions were documented by Padre Pio of Pietrelcina in Italy. He also saw souls in purgatory. He also witnessed their release. He also noted that the souls who had suffered patiently in life passed through purification quickly. The pattern holds across centuries. The mechanism remains consistent. Patience and suffering purchases swift passage through purgatory. That is how the economy works. That is what the young nun discovered. That is what Teresa documented. That is what we need to understand. If you are suffering right now, if your body is failing, if pain fills your days, if sickness has become your constant companion, you have a choice. You can rage against it and let bitterness poison your soul, or you can accept it patiently, offer it up, unite it with Christ's suffering, and let it burn away everything that stands between you and heaven. The young nun chose the second path. She endured a tissue of maladies patiently, and when she died, she barely had to suffer at all after death. 15 minutes, then heaven. That is the reward for one patient moment of silent suffering. Not that the suffering ends, but that it transforms from mere pain into spiritual currency, from biological decay into metaphysical refinement, from pointless tragedy into purposeful preparation. The young nun figured that out. Teresa documented it, and now you know. In 1562, 7 years into her mystical visions, Teresa founded the first convent of the Discalced Carmelite reform in Ávila. She called it St. Joseph. She insisted on strict poverty, complete enclosure, and a return to the original Carmelite rule. She spent the next 20 years founding 16 more convents across Spain. She traveled thousands of miles in crude carts over terrible roads. She negotiated with bishops, argued with town councils, dealt with opposition from wealthy donors and powerful clergy. Her health never recovered from the paralysis she suffered in 1539. She was sick most of her adult life, chronic pain, frequent fainting, irregular heartbeat. Severe headaches, vomiting, fatigue. The tissue of maladies she endured made the young nun's suffering look short by comparison. But Teresa accepted it patiently. She offered it up. She united her suffering with Christ's. She kept working despite the pain. She kept founding convents despite the exhaustion. She kept writing despite the weakness. And when she died on October 4th, 1582, at age 67, witnesses claimed her face. Became radiant. Her incorrupt body remains preserved today in Alba de Tormes, white and smooth like a 3-year-old child despite all the illness she endured. No wrinkles, no signs of decay, a sweet smell nobody could identify. That is what patient suffering does to a soul. It refines it so thoroughly that even the body bears witness to the transformation. Teresa's final entry in her journal before she died reads like this: Lord, I am a daughter of the Church. She had spent 47 years as a nun, 20 years in mystical visions, 2 decades reforming the Carmelites, a lifetime of chronic illness patiently endured. And when she died, she needed very little purification, maybe 15 minutes like the young nun, maybe less. Maybe she went straight through. We do not have documentation of someone seeing her soul ascend because she died in a small town during a journey, and the circumstances were chaotic. But based on how she lived, based on what she endured, based on how she offered up every moment of suffering, it is reasonable to assume her passage through purgatory was swift. The mathematics of redemption are precise. Every moment of patient suffering counts. Every day of illness accepted without bitterness earns credit in an economy we barely understand. The young nun lived 18 or 20 years in constant pain and needed 15 minutes of purgatory. Teresa lived 67 years with chronic illness and probably needed even less time. Both of them figured out the secret. Both of them used their suffering instead of wasting it. Both of them transformed pain into spiritual currency through conscious intention and patient endurance. You can do the same. Whatever you're suffering right now, offer it up. Do not waste it by complaining. Do not poison it with bitterness. Accept it patiently. Unite it with Christ's suffering on the cross. Let it burn away your selfishness and pride while you are still alive. Then when you die, you will pass through purgatory quickly because most of the work will already be done. That is not a metaphor. That is not wishful thinking. That is what Teresa saw. That is what the young nun experienced. That is how the economy of salvation actually works. The last thing Teresa documented about the young nun is this: her face was resplendent with light when her soul ascended to heaven, not after hours of purgatory, not after days, after 15 minutes. The purification was swift because the preparation had been thorough. The reward was immediate because the payment had been made. The soul that endured a tissue of maladies patiently in life needed barely any refinement after death. That is the reward. That is what patience purchases. That is what the young nun discovered and what Teresa saw and what we need to understand. There is a grave in the Carmelite monastery in Ávila. It holds the body of a young woman who died at 18 or 20 years old. Her name is not on the marker because cloistered nuns often disappeared into anonymity. But Teresa saw her soul. Teresa documented her passage. Teresa made sure we would know that a life of patient suffering is never wasted, that every moment of pain accepted without bitterness counts toward purification, that the reward for enduring a tissue of maladies patiently is swift passage through purgatory and immediate entrance into heaven. 15 minutes, that is all it took, for a soul that had spent 18 or 20 years suffering constantly and patiently. 15 minutes of final refinement, then resplendent light, then heaven, then eternal rest for a young woman who never rested in life. That is the mathematics. That is the economy. That is what Teresa of Ávila saw with her own eyes and wrote down for us to read 460 years later.